chapter 31 is where we got 2 weeks ago. Of course, last week, we took time out and looked at the Christmas story, a little bit different twist on the Christmas story last week. So we'll be getting back in the book of Job here today. Job 31 is where we got. I'm on 31 verse 1. We got down to verse 9, but I'm going to reread verses 1 through 12 when we get started here in a minute. So Job 31, if you want to go ahead and be turning there. But just a brief recap of what we talked about 2 weeks ago. We looked at Job's three friends. Of course, they had stopped their speeches. They had stopped their speaking. And Job had made all his replies to those speeches. And it's as if in these chapters here, 29, 30, and 31, Job is saying, okay, now I rest my case. And it's like he's making his closing arguments. We talked about that a little bit because we've been talking about how this is like a court scene. A lot of this study has been. And in chapter 29, remember we looked about how he recalled the past blessings that he had in his life. And he had a lot of blessings in his life in the past. We looked at some of those. Chapter 30, of course, he talked about the present sufferings that he was continuing to go through. So, he wasn't too thrilled about that, but he did talk about that. And in chapter 31, he hopes that God will vindicate him in the future. And so we see the past, present, and in the future. And we had started here in chapter number 31. And Job has 5 things to say about himself in defense of his vindication. Remember, he didn't know why all this was going on in his life. He thought God maybe was judging him for some reason or other. And of course, his 3 friends, they accused him of sinning, and that's why these things were going on. So he was seeking vindication and trying to reaffirm his integrity. So he talks about he gives 5 things about himself in this defense. And the first one we looked at, or we had started about, was Job the man. And he gives 3 specific sins that could trip any man or woman up, or even Job himself. And the first one we looked at was lust. We talked about that, verses 1 through 4 in the chapter. And then we talked about deceit in verses 5 through 8. And then we had gotten to the third sin, and that's the sin of adultery. And he talks about it in verses 9 through 12. But I want to, again, so for Job 31, I want to go ahead and reread verses 1 through 12, since it's been a couple weeks since we've been, in the lesson. And then talk about this third sin here that Job mentions. So Job chapter 31, verse number 1, I made a covenant with mine eyes. Why then should I think upon a maid? For what portion of God is there from above, and what inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is not destruction to the wicked, and a strange punishment to the workers of iniquity? Doth not he see my ways and count all my steps? So remember, these first 4 verses, he's talking about the sin of lust. And that's how he starts out. He says he made a covenant with his eyes, so he wouldn't do these things. And we know, the Bible says lust is the first step, right? When lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. Sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. So he talked about lust in those 4 verses. Verse 5, if I have walked with vanity, or if my foot hath hasted to deceit, let me be weighed in an even balance, that God may know mine integrity. If my step hath turned out of the way, and mine heart walked after mine eyes, and if any blot hath cleaved to mine hands, then let me sow, and let another eat. Yea, let my offspring be rooted out. So he talks about deceit in these verses. And Job never used any kind of deception to get the things he had. Remember, he was the greatest man of all these, but he didn't use any deceit against anybody to get that kind of thing. And he tells us here in verse 6, he said, if you don't believe me, just check me out if you don't believe what I'm saying to you. So he talks about lust, he talks about deceit. And in verses 9 through 12, he talks about the third sin, and that's adultery. So verse 9, if my heart have been deceived by a woman, or if I have laid wait at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind unto another, and let others bow down unto her. For this is an heinous crime, yea, it is an iniquity to be punished by the judges. For it is fire that consumeth to destruction, and would root out all mine increase. So this third sin that he talks about that could trip him up, or anybody up, any man, any woman up, is the sin of adultery. In verse 9 and 10, he starts out again. He says, just check me out. He says, if you think that I've done anything like this, you're wrong. If you don't believe me, just check me out here in verses 9 and 10. But look what he calls this sin. Again, we're talking about the sin of adultery. Look what he calls it in the first part of verse number 11. He says, for this is an heinous crime.
Right.
The Hebrew definition of heinous here is grossly wicked or reprehensible, abominable or vile. And that's what he calls this sin of adultery. And remember, Job is probably the oldest book we have recorded in the Bible. So in the oldest book of the Bible, this is what he calls adultery back then. And we know it's the same today. It's a heinous crime today, just like it was then. It's no different today. And look what he talks about in verses 11 and 12. He says there's shameful and painful consequences for anybody that gets tripped up in this sin of adultery. Let me give you some scriptures. We all know them. We've heard these hundreds of times. But just as a reminder here, because Job is talking about this third sin, adultery, which could trip anybody up if they're not careful. Proverbs 6:27 through 29 says, can a man take fire in his bosom and his clothes not be burned? Can one go upon hot coals and his feet not be burned? So he that goeth in unto his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her, shall not be innocent. So he talks about the fire. Job talked about it being a fire, and now here in Proverbs it's referred to as a fire as well. What about Ephesians 5, verses 3 through 7? But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not once be named among you as becometh saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater, hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God. Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be not ye therefore partakers with them. So again, in Ephesians here, Paul, he says some of the same things that Job has to say about the consequences. He said, because of these things, the wrath of God cometh upon the children of disobedience. And then one more, of course, we all know, we've heard it again hundreds of times. Hebrews 13, verse 4, marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. So Job's reminding us here that this sin of adultery, he calls it a heinous crime. And just as that's what it was back then, the same can be said about it today. So these are three sins here. Remember, he's talking about Job, the man himself. It's three sins that could have tripped him up if he would have allowed it, but he never did. So Job is saying, he said, I'm not guilty of any of these sins, lust, deceit, or adultery, either one. Now remember, Job here he's seeking vindication here, so that's why he's talking about himself. All right, so not only Job the man, but what about Job the employer? Look at verses 13, 14, and 15. Job says, if I did despise the cause of my manservant or of my maidservant when they contended with me, what then shall I do when God riseth up, or when he visiteth? What shall I answer him? Did not he that made me in the womb make him, and did not one fashion us in the womb? So the employer here, Job, he talks about how he's got manservants and he's got maidservants. And you're not going to find anywhere where he did not treat them fairly. I believe Job treated them fairly. I believe he was a good employer. Matter of fact, verse number 15, he says, I'm not any better than they are. He said, we were both formed in the womb the same way, so I'm not any better than my employees are. So Job, he was a good employer. He was fair in his dealings with his servants. What about Job the neighbor? In verses 16 through 23. And then also verses 29 through 32. Let's read those. Job 31 verse 16. If I have withheld the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel, myself alone, and the fatherless hath not eaten thereof. For from my youth he was brought up with me, as with a father I have guided her from my mother's womb. If I have seen any perish for want of clothing, or any poor without covering, if his loins have not blessed me, and if he were not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the fatherless, when I saw my help in the gate, then let mine arm fall from my shoulder blade, and mine arm be broken from the bone. For destruction from God was a terror to me, and by reason of his highness I could not endure. Skip down to verse number 29. If I rejoiced at the destruction of him that hated me, or lifted up myself when evil found him, neither have I suffered my mouth to sin by wishing a curse to his soul. If the men of my tabernacle said not, Oh, that we had of his flesh, we cannot be satisfied. The stranger did not lodge in the street, but I opened my doors to the traveler. So here Job's talking about himself as being a good neighbor. And Job was generous to all. It didn't matter who it was. He talks about the poor and the widows, verses 16 and 19. He talks about the orphans or the fatherless in verses 17 and 21. He always helped them. He even talked about how he even helped his enemies. Right. There in verse number 29. And then in verse 32, he talks about that he helped the strangers. He said, I wouldn't let them just sleep outside. I would let them come in. And he talks about his tabernacle, verse 31. That's talking about his house. He would bring them in. So he was generous to the strangers. And again, he says, if you don't believe all this stuff, again, he says, check me out. Verse 22, he says, if you found me not being a good neighbor, he says, then let mine arm fall from my shoulder blade and mine arm be broken from the bone. So again, Job, he's not boasting here in the things he's saying. He's just stating facts. Because remember, his friends earlier had accused him of just the opposite. They said, Job, you got all this wealth because of deceit and you wouldn't help people. You're robbing from the widows and the poor and the fatherless. But that's not the case. So Job here, he was just stating facts, just proving his point. Remember, he's seeking vindication, so that's why he was just stating these facts about himself. So we see here Job the neighbor. What about Job the worshiper? Verses 24 through 28. He says, if I have made gold my hope, or have said to find gold, thou art my confidence, if I rejoice because my wealth was great, and because mine hand had gotten much, if I beheld the sun when it shined, or the moon walking in darkness, and my heart hath been secretly enticed, or my mouth has kissed my hands, this also were an iniquity to be punished by the judge, for I should have denied the God that is above. So Job was a true worshiper. He worshiped God with a sincere heart. He didn't worship his riches that he had, or he didn't trust in his riches for security. As you'll see in verses 24 and 25, he says, I didn't make my wealth my hope. He said, but I trusted in God and I worshiped him. He says, if I had made my wealth my God and worshipped it, or held my security into it, he says it would be an iniquity to be punished by God in verse number 28. So Job, he was a true worshiper. He didn't worship his material possessions, but he worshiped the Lord. So we see Job the worshiper. Right. And then the last one here, we see Job the steward in verses 33 through 40. He says, if I have covered my transgressions as Adam by hiding mine iniquity in my bosom, did I fear a great multitude, or did the contempt of families terrify me, that I kept silence and went not out the door? Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him the number of my steps. As a prince I would go near to him. If my land cry against me, or that the furrows likewise thereof complain, if I have eaten the fruits thereof without money, or have caused the owners thereof to lose their life, let thistles grow instead of wheat, and cockle instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. So we see here the steward that Job talks about, talking about himself. But first, verse 33, he reminds us again that he didn't hide anything. He didn't have anything to hide. And he reminds us of Adam. Of course, Adam and Eve, we know the story. When they sinned in the garden, they hid themselves. Right. And so they were trying to hide from the Lord. But Job says, I don't have anything to hide. He said, I haven't done anything to hide for. And he talks about the land here, talking about being a good steward. He talks about the land here in verse 38, and talks about the furrows, how he was getting ready to plant the land, things like that. And then he talks about the fruits from the land in verse number 39. And then he talks about the wheat and the barley that he would grow in his land. in verse number 40. So we see here Job here, he was a good steward of the land that God had given him. And, he probably had a lot, greatest man of the East. He probably had a lot of land. And he says again here, just check me out. I've mentioned that 3 or 4 times already. He says, if you don't believe these things about me, just look at my record, just check me out. And he says, if these things aren't true, verse 40, he says, let thistles grow instead of wheat. Of course, thistles is just an old prickly plant. It's not good for anything. He says, or cockle instead of barley. And that's just another useless plant. Cockle, just a useless plant that would grow up in the wheat and barley. He says, let those things grow instead of my wheat and barley if these things aren't true that I've been telling you. So we see here, Job has given us 5 things about himself. Again, trying to vindicate himself before God and before his friends. But notice the last part of verse number 40. Excuse me. He says, the words of Job are ended. So, remember, we talked about that this is like Job was making his final argument because of all that had been done. His friends had spoke. Now he had made his reply. Now he had made his final argument. So he had made his case, rested his case here. The words of Job, he says, are ended. And he had challenged God in some of these chapters here, some of these verses, because he was sure God would vindicate him, because he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. So he knew God would vindicate him, but at the same time, his 3 friends were sure that God would condemn him, because again, they said, Job, you've sinned. That's why all these things are happening to you. So what's next? I mean, we've seen the case here. It's clearly been laid out for us. Excuse me. So we see Job here. He was silent, said the words of Job are ended. His 3 friends are silent. Look at the first part of chapter 32, verse 1. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job. So now Job was silent. His 3 friends were silent. And even God was silent for now. Of course, we'll see later where God finally does come and he speaks. But right now, God's silent. Job, his 3 friends, God's silent. So now we have a 5th participant that comes on the scene now. And his name is Elihu. And we'll see a little bit about him here as we get started in Elihu and what he has to say. We don't know much about Elihu. About all we know about him is what's mentioned here in these first few verses. Verse 2, verse 4, verse number 6. Of course, verse number 2 says, Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barashel, the Buzite, of the kindred of Ram. So we know he was a Buzite. And the only record that I could find that we have of that is found over in Genesis chapter 22, verse number 21. Nahor was Abraham's brother, and Nahor had a son whose name was Buz. So this is probably the same family. So we see that Elihu here, he came from Nahor, Abraham's brother, in his family line, the family tree there. So that's again all the information we have about who he is and where he came from. Second thing we know about him is he was considerably younger than Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, or Zophar. Look at verse 4. See, it says, Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken because they were elder than he. Also verse number 6. And Elihu the son of Barashel the Buzite answered and said, I am young, and ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you mine opinion. So these are about the only 2 things we know about him. He was considerably younger than they were, and that he was a Buzite from Nahor, Abraham's brother's family. Now also notice his speech here, so we'll get into in the next few weeks, was almost as long as the other 3 combined. His speech was 6 chapters, 32 through 37, and the other 3, theirs totaled 8 chapters combined. There was 2 of them spoke 3 times and 1 of them spoke twice. So theirs were 8. So his speech is almost as long as theirs combined. We'll also see that Elihu said some of the things that the other 3 had to say. A few of the things, but his purpose was different from theirs. His purpose was not really trying to prove that Job was a sinner. And we know clearly from our study that that's his other 3 friends, that's what they were trying to do, is trying to prove Job a sinner. But his viewpoint is that Job's view of God, he thought Job's view of God was wrong. At least that was Elihu's opinion. And you're going to see that word several times here in this chapter, the word opinion. So he introduces us also to a new truth into this debate that's been going on, for a long time now already. And the new truth here that Elihu puts into this debate is that God sometimes sends suffering, not necessarily to punish people, punish us for our sins, but maybe to keep us from sinning. Maybe sometimes that's why suffering comes. We'll see that in chapter 33 when we get on into there. And a second reason, sometimes we may get suffering in our life just to make us a better person. Right. And he talks about that some on in chapter 36. So we'll get into that a little bit later. So these are the couple reasons that Elihu is going to argue that suffering sometimes comes in our lives. And Paul, of course, would agree with the first one, that sometimes it's just to keep us from sinning. Because 2 Corinthians 12, verses 7 through 10, this is what Paul had to say. He says, "And lest I should be exalted above measure, through the abundance of revelations there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan, to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. For this thing I besought the Lord thrice, that it might depart from me. And he said, My grace is sufficient for thee. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in necessities, in persecutions, and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong." So Paul here, he agreed with that. He said, "Lest I should be exalted above measure." That's why this thorn in the flesh was given to me, to keep me, maybe to keep me from sinning. And then the writer of Hebrews, which of course I think we all agree was the Apostle Paul as well, he would agree with Elihu's second argument, and that was sometimes maybe suffering comes in our lives to make us better people, maybe to make us a better person. And he tells us that in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1. He says, "Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run with patience the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest ye be wearied and faint in your minds. Ye have not resisted unto blood, striving unto sin." So, of course, this is talking about Jesus, and we know Jesus had not sinned, but all this suffering, the cross, the crucifixion, the scourging, everything that came upon him, made him a better person, because it says he despised the shame and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. So, that's maybe an example of somebody that's suffering, not because of sin or anything like that, but to make them a better person. But also, in this same chapter, let me continue in verse number 5. Hebrews 12, verse 5 says, "And ye have forgotten the exhortation which speaketh unto you as children. My son, despise not thou the chastening of the Lord, nor faint when thou art rebuked of him. For whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. If ye endure chastening, God dealeth with you as with sons. For what son is he whom the Father chasteneth not? But if ye be without chastisement, whereof all are partakers, then are ye bastards and not sons. Furthermore, we have had fathers of our flesh which corrected us, and we gave them reverence. Shall we not much rather be in subjection unto the Father of spirits and live? For they verily for a few days chastened us after their own pleasure, but he for our profit, that we might be partakers of his holiness. Now no chastening for the present seemeth to be joyous, but grievous. Nevertheless afterward it yieldeth the peaceable fruit of righteousness unto them that are exercised thereby." So this is talking about maybe if suffering, maybe if it is a form of chastisement, it's still to make us a better person, because he says here, for our profit. He does it for our profit. Right. So these are a couple reasons here that Elihu gives that the Apostle Paul would have agreed with. Maybe suffering comes in our lives to keep us from sinning, maybe to make us a better person. So here in chapter number 32, Elihu really doesn't start his argument to on over in chapter number 33. 32 is actually more, I guess, of an introduction, because he's been kind of just sitting around waiting while all this was going on, and now he's ready to speak. So he starts here in chapter 32 by giving 4 reasons that he felt it was important for him to speak, and it was also important for those in attendance, Job and his 3 friends, that they need to listen. First of all, let's start by reading chapter 32, verses 1 through 7, and see his first reason. Chapter 32, verse 1, So these three men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then was kindled the wrath of Elihu the son of Barashel the Buzite of the kindred of Ram. Against Job was his wrath kindled, because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his three friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. Now Elihu had waited till Job had spoken, because they were elder than he. When Elihu saw there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, then was his wrath kindled. And Elihu the son of Barashel the Buzite answered and said, I am young, ye are very old. Wherefore I was afraid, and durst not show you mine opinion. I said, days should speak, and multitude of years should teach wisdom. So his first reasoning he gives for wanting to speak, he was just simply disgusted at what had been going on. Notice 4 times in these verses that I read, he talks about how he was angry. He said his wrath was kindled. So Elihu here, he was an angry young man because of all this that had been going on. Twice in verse number 2, he talks about his wrath being kindled. Once in verse 3, and once also again verse number 5. He was angry for 2 reasons. He was angry with his 3 friends. In verse number 3, let's see what it says. He says, also against his 3 friends was his wrath kindled, because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. So they were condemning Job. So that's one reason he was mad. He was mad at these 3 friends, and they had not proven anything but what they had to say. But he was also mad at Job because Job seemed to be justifying himself rather than God. The last part of verse number 2 says, because he justified himself rather than God, or at least that was Elihu. That was his opinion of Job anyway, that he seemed to not be justifying God, but rather trying to justify himself. But it's interesting to note here, at least Elihu had enough respect for his elders to wait till they finished speaking before he started to give his opinion. Verses 4, 6, and 7, 3 different times, he reminds them that he's considerably younger than they are, but at least he had respect to his elders and waited until they were finished their speaking. So that's one reason he felt he needed to talk, because he was just disgusted at what was going on, what his 3 friends were saying, and even maybe at some of Job's reply to his 3 friends. But the second reason we find in verses 8 through 10. It says, but there is a spirit in man, and the inspiration of the Almighty giveth them understanding. Great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Therefore I said, hearken to me, and I will show you, and I will show mine opinion. So his second reason was he felt that he was inspired. Notice verse number 8. He talks about the inspiration of the Almighty. So he felt that his words and his speech was inspired by God, so he needed to speak. And then it's interesting again in verse number 9, he talks about how that if you think about it, age should produce wisdom, and I think a lot of times it does, but Elihu says here sometimes it doesn't. He says, great men are not always wise, neither do the aged understand judgment. Proverbs 16:31 says, the hoary head is a crown of glory if it be found in the way of righteousness. So just because somebody may be old does not necessarily always equate to being wise, and that's what Elihu here he's saying, because he didn't claim to have a lot of wisdom through experience or through age, because he was a younger man, but instead he claimed to have wisdom because he was inspired by the Almighty, because he was inspired by God. But notice he did use the phrase mine opinion several times. I mentioned that earlier. He uses it here in verse number 10. He says, I will show mine opinion. Verse number 6, he says, show you mine opinion. And then again in verse 17, I will also show mine opinion. So at least when he was making his speech, at least he did preface it that way and say, okay, I'm going to show you my opinion of the matter. And we actually need to do that today as teachers, speakers, preachers, whatever it may be. We need to be clear when it's opinion or if it's scripture, and we need to be sure and let everybody know, if we're teaching, preaching, whatever the case may be, if we have an opinion, we need to preface it that way, and I try to do that. If I tell you something that's just my opinion, I'm going to tell you that it's just my opinion and not necessarily the Scripture. So we just need to make sure that people know the difference. Whomever we may be speaking with, they just need to know the difference between opinions or actual Scripture. So that's the second reason that he felt like he needed to speak. First, of course, he was disgusted with what was going on. Secondly, he felt he was inspired, so he needed to speak. And then the third reason we find here, beginning in verses 11, but our time is up, so we won't even get into this. But his third reason, he felt he could be impartial, where maybe the other three friends weren't. They all seemed to be on the same side with the same argument for the most part. But Elihu says here, he says, I'm going to come on the scene, and he said, he said, I can be impartial with the things that's been going on here with these conversations, these arguments and speeches that have been going on. So Lord willing, we'll take up here in chapter 32, verse number 11, next week as we get back into the lesson. Thank you.